The cry cut through the still night like a knife through cloth. It was thin, high, and desperate, carried on the wind across the empty prairie. Jed Callahan stopped in his tracks, one hand tightening on the worn stock of his rifle. Coyotes didn't cry like that. Neither did calves. This was human. A baby. The moon was a pale slice above the horizon, silvering the tall grass that bent in the night breeze. Jed stood still, boots rooted in the dirt, every instinct telling him to turn back. Out here, miles from his ranch house, strange noises usually meant trouble. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something in his chest shifted. He took a breath and started walking toward the sound. The prairie seemed endless, each step crunching softly over brittle weeds. Jed followed the sound like a bloodhound, his heartbeat growing heavier with each cry. Then, in the faint light, he saw it. A small shape near a mesquite tree, half wrapped in what looked like an old army jacket. Jed knelt down slow. The jacket was stiff with dirt and dust, the fabric worn thin at the seams. Inside it was a baby, no older than a few weeks. Its tiny face was red from crying, fists trembling as it squirmed against the cold. For a long moment, Jed just stared. Out here, a baby alone didn't happen by accident. Somebody left it on purpose. He slid the rifle onto the ground, then carefully gathered the child into his arms. Its skin was cool to the touch, and he could feel the frail chest rising and falling too fast. "Easy now," Jed muttered, voice low and uncertain. "I got you." The baby whimpered, pressing its face against his coat as if searching for warmth. Jed looked around the dark horizon. Nothing but grass and open sky. No wagon, no campfire, no tracks he could see. He swallowed hard. But let's go back to where it all started. Jed Callahan had never asked for much out of life. He ran cattle on a spread of land most men wouldn't touch, too far from town and too close to the edge of Apache country. A quiet man, with a scar down his cheek from a bar fight he never talked about. Jed lived alone in a small cabin that smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds. His horse, Dusty, was his only companion. The war had taken plenty from him. Friends buried in shallow graves, a brother who never came home. Jed himself carried ghosts he didn't talk about, not to anyone. That night, before he heard the cry, he'd been riding the fence line like he always did, making sure rustlers hadn't cut through. The sky was clear, stars burning bright, and Jed felt the usual quiet settle in his chest. Out here, life was simple, hard but simple. And then came that cry. Now, holding the baby close, Jed felt a strange unease creeping in. He stood, glancing once more at the horizon, as if whoever had left the child might still be watching. He carried the baby to Dusty, who snorted nervously at the bundle. Jed swung up into the saddle, cradling the infant against his chest. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than ever. The baby's cries faded into soft whimpers, its tiny body shivering against the night air. Jed urged Dusty faster, his jaw tight. Inside the cabin, Jed lit the lantern and set the baby gently on his narrow bed. The yellow light flickered over the rough-hewn walls, the iron stove in the corner, the half-empty coffee pot still sitting cold on the table. The army jacket told its own story. It wasn't new. Buttons missing. A name stitched on the inside, faded but legible, H. Roland. Jed sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the child. "What in God's name am I supposed to do with you?" The baby's eyes fluttered open, deep, dark, and unfocused. For a fleeting second, Jed felt something twist in his chest. He poured some milk into a small tin cup and dipped a rag into it, letting the baby suckle on the cloth. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. By the time the fire in the stove burned steady, the baby had drifted to sleep. Jed sat in the chair by the bed, rifle leaning against the wall, staring at the small bundle wrapped in the army jacket. He didn't know who H. Roland was, didn't know why the baby had been left out there. But he knew this, come morning, word would get around. And in a place like this, a man found with a baby that wasn't his never meant anything good. Jed leaned back, eyes heavy but mind restless. He told himself he'd ride to town tomorrow, maybe find out who the child belonged to. But deep down, he already knew tomorrow would bring more than questions. Because in the Old West, nothing stayed secret for long. Outside, the wind howled softly across the prairie. And far off in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, another sound stirred. A lone horse galloping in the night. Dawn broke slow over the prairie, the horizon glowing pink and gold as Jed stepped out onto the porch. The baby was still asleep inside, swaddled in that tattered army jacket. Dusty stood tied to the post, ears twitching, restless for a ride. Jed ran a hand over his face, the weight of the night still heavy on him. He'd barely slept. Every creak of the wind, every coyote yip outside had made him think someone might be coming. By the time he saddled Dusty and cradled the baby close against his chest, he'd made up his mind. He'd ride to town, find the sheriff, and hand the child over. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. The dirt road to town was quiet, just the soft thud of hooves on dry earth. The baby stirred once, then fell back asleep. Jed tried not to look at its tiny face. Something about it made him feel like he was already in too deep. When he reached town, the first pair of eyes to see him were old Mrs. Porter's, peering out the window of the dry goods store. By the time he tied Dusty outside the sheriff's office, half the town was watching. Inside, Sheriff Briggs looked up from his desk, pipe dangling from his mouth. Briggs was a broad man with a bristly mustache, the kind who liked law to stay simple. "Well, hell," Briggs muttered, standing. "What's that you got?" Jed shifted the baby slightly. "Found him out near the Mesquite Flats last night, wrapped in this army coat." Briggs stepped closer, squinting at the jacket. "Name stitched in here, Roland. Don't know it. You see anyone else out there?" "No." Briggs scratched at his chin. "Could be deserters. Could be worse. You leave the baby with me. I'll wire the fort, see if Roland's one of theirs." Jed hesitated, glancing down at the baby. It stirred, making a small noise as if sensing the change. Briggs noticed. "Don't go getting attached, Callahan. Ain't your problem." Jed opened his mouth to agree, but before he could speak, the door swung open. It was Hank Dobbs, a rancher who never missed a chance to stick his nose where it didn't belong. "Well, would you look at that?" Hank drawled, eyeing the bundle. "Jed Callahan with a baby? Folks'll be talking about this for weeks." A couple of men from the saloon followed behind him, smirking. Briggs sighed. "Boys, this ain't your concern." "Maybe not," Hank said. "But folks around here don't take kindly to strangers dumping problems on our land. You don't know whose kid that is. Could be Apache. Could be outlaw spawn. Could bring trouble down on all of us." Jed's jaw tightened. "It's a baby, Hank. Don't much matter where it came from." "That's where you're wrong," Hank shot back. "Out here, everything matters. You bring the wrong blood into town, we all pay for it." The room felt colder suddenly. Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "Enough, Dobbs. We'll sort it out proper." But Jed could see it in their eyes, the fear, the suspicion already spreading. He handed the baby toward Briggs, fingers lingering on the worn jacket. But just as the sheriff reached out, the infant whimpered softly, a fragile sound that stopped Jed cold. Briggs waited, brow furrowed. Jed looked down at the tiny face, lips trembling from the cold morning air. For reasons he couldn't explain, his chest tightened. He drew the child back in against him. "I'll keep him," Jed said quietly. Briggs blinked. "Callahan, I'll take care of him. You can still send your wire, but till we know, he stays with me." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but you'd better be ready. This ain't gonna sit right with folks." Hank let out a sharp laugh. "You're outta your damn mind, Callahan. Mark my words. This'll bring trouble to your door." Jed didn't answer. He just turned and walked out, the baby tucked close, every step feeling heavier than the last. By the time he mounted Dusty, word had already spread. Townsfolk watched from porches and windows, whispering, eyes full of doubt. Jed rode slow through the street, ignoring the stares. He didn't know yet that Hank Dobbs would be the first to stir up real trouble. That night, Hank would sit in the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen that Jed Callahan had gone soft, keeping a wild blood baby, like some kind of charity case. And it wouldn't be long before men started choosing sides. As Jed rode out of town, the wind picked up, dry and sharp, carrying the first faint hint of a storm. The baby shifted in his arms, tiny fingers gripping the edge of his coat. Jed looked down at it, jaw tight. He didn't say it out loud, but in his gut he already knew. He'd just made a choice that couldn't be undone. By the third day, the sky had turned the color of gunmetal. A storm had rolled in from the west, heavy clouds pressing low over the prairie. Jed stood on his porch, baby cradled against his chest, watching the horizon. It wasn't just the storm that unsettled him. Dusty had been restless all morning, ears flicking toward the ridge. The cattle were bunched tighter than usual, uneasy. Jed knew those signs. When the hoofbeats came, they came slow, steady, and deliberate. Jed stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, baby tucked inside the army jacket against his chest. 3 riders emerged from the ridge, dark silhouettes against the gray sky. Their horses were lean, their faces hard. At the front rode Hank Dobbs. "Well now," Hank called as they drew closer, his voice carrying over the wind. "Didn't figure you'd have the guts to stand out here waitin' on us." Jed stayed still. "Don't see any reason to hide." The men pulled up just short of the fence. Hank shifted in his saddle, gaze flicking to the bundle in Jed's arms. "Word spread far, Callahan. Folks don't like what you're doing. Keeping a baby that ain't yours, God knows where it came from. Some say it's Apache. Some say it's outlaw spawn. Either way, it ain't right." Jed's jaw tightened. "It's just a child, Hank." Hank leaned forward in the saddle. "A child that's gonna bring trouble to every one of us. You really think whoever left it out, there's just gonna forget about it?" Jed didn't answer. The third rider, a wiry man with a scar along his jaw, spat in the dirt. "Saw some tracks out past the flats yesterday. Weren't white men's boots. You thinkin' what I'm thinkin', Hank?" Hank's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I'm thinkin' it. Someone's watchin' this place. Waiting." Jed shifted the baby slightly, feeling its tiny warmth against him. "If they're out there, they'll get what they came for. But I won't hand over a baby to God knows what fate just to keep your whiskey circle happy." Hank's jaw flexed. "This ain't about whiskey. It's about survival. We don't want trouble." Jed's grip tightened on the rifle. "Then leave." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled low through the grass, rattling the fence posts. Finally, Hank spat into the dirt, turned his horse. "Fine. You want to play the hero, Callahan? Be my guest. But don't say we didn't warn you." The 3 men rode off, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm clouds. Jed stood there long after they'd gone, baby still pressed close. He felt the weight of what was coming pressing down harder than the sky above him. That night, thunder rolled across the plains. Jed lit the lantern and sat at the table, rifle within reach. The baby lay in a small basket beside the bed, bundled tight, breathing softly. He tried to quiet his thoughts, but the storm outside wasn't the only thing keeping him awake. Because somewhere out there, past the ridges beyond the flats, he could feel eyes watching. Near midnight, the storm broke. Rain hammered the roof, wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Through the roar of the storm, Jed heard it. A faint whistle. Not wind, not animal. A signal. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the window. A flicker of movement just for a second by the tree line. Jed's blood went cold. Whoever wanted that baby, they weren't going to wait much longer. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air heavy and still. The land smelled of wet earth and grass, steam rising from the sun-warmed mud. Jed hadn't slept. He'd sat up all night with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark window. But whoever had been out there never came. When the baby stirred in its basket, Jed's chest eased just slightly. He lifted the child, wrapping it in a dry blanket, the worn army jacket folded close around it. "You're tougher than you look," Jed murmured, voice low, almost surprised at himself for speaking. The baby's dark eyes blinked open, unfocused but calm. Tiny fingers reached clumsily, catching the edge of Jed's shirt. For the first time since finding it on the prairie, Jed let out a small laugh, short, almost disbelieving. "You got some fight in you." The sound of hoofbeats broke the moment. Jed turned toward the open door, rifle in reach but not raised. It wasn't Hank Dobbs this time. It was a single rider, one Jed didn't recognize. A woman, thin and weathered, her hair braided back, a rifle resting across her saddle. She reined in short of the porch, eyes sharp but not hostile. "That jacket," she said, voice steady. "It belonged to my brother." Jed didn't move. "Roland." She nodded once. "Henry Roland. He was Army. Fought out here. Got himself killed last spring. His wife. She didn't make it either." Her gaze drifted to the baby in Jed's arms. "That's their boy." The woman swung down from the saddle, boots squelching in the wet dirt. She stepped closer, slow, like she didn't want to spook either of them. "I've been looking for him," she said softly. "Took me near a month to track this far. By the time I found where they'd camped, she was gone. The baby too." Jed looked down at the child, then back at her. "You left him out there?" he asked quietly. Her face twisted, pain raw in her eyes. "No, I'd never." She swallowed hard. "I found blood at that camp. Whoever took him, they wanted the mother dead. They left him for coyotes." Jed's grip on the baby tightened. The woman's eyes softened. "I'm his aunt. Name's Clara Rowland. I've got a place 2 days' ride north. Good land. Good people. I can raise him." For a long moment, Jed just stood there, the weight of his choice pressing down on him. Clara stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I'm grateful you found him. You saved him. But he's all I've got left of my brother. Please." Jed looked at the baby. Its tiny face, the way it curled closer against him as if sensing his hesitation. He realized, with a heaviness he hadn't expected, that somewhere in those sleepless nights, this child had become his. The door creaked behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Hank Dobbs. "Well, ain't this sweet?" Hank drawled from the porch. "Figured you'd have company sooner or later. See, Callahan? Trouble finds you every time." Clara stiffened, her hand twitching near her rifle. Jed didn't move. "Go home, Hank." But Hank just grinned. "That kid's got bad blood. You hand him over, we'll all sleep easier." Clara stepped up beside Jed, eyes locked on Hank. "That boy's blood is as good as yours. Maybe better." Hank's grin faltered. Jed's voice was steady now, cold as the steel in his rifle. "You take another step, Dobbs, and you'll see just how soft I ain't." For the first time, Hank hesitated. The baby let out a soft coo, breaking the silence. Hank spat into the dirt, turned, and walked back to his horse without another word. When he was gone, Jed finally looked at Clara again. "Take him," Jed said quietly, though the words felt heavier than any he'd ever spoken. Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling as she gathered the baby close. She pressed her face to the child's head, her shoulders shaking once, hard. Jed watched in silence. In that moment, with the sun cutting through the clouds and lighting the wet prairie, something inside him settled. A quiet knowing that the choice he'd made had been the right one, no matter what came next. Clara stayed the night. They sat by the fire after the baby had fallen asleep, sharing what little food Jed had: beans, cornbread, and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She told him about Henry, how he'd gone off to fight a war that never truly ended. About her sister-in-law, a quiet woman who'd carried their boy through miles of hardship after Henry's death, only to be cut down in the wilderness by men Clara never caught. Jed didn't talk much, but he listened. The way Clara's voice caught when she said Henry's name reminded him of his own brother, the one he'd buried in Tennessee years ago. Morning came too soon. Clara packed what little she'd brought, securing her saddle with practiced hands. Jed held the baby one last time. Its dark eyes stared up at him, unknowing, trusting. "You'll take good care of him," Jed said, more statement than question. Clara nodded. "I swear it. He'll know who saved him, and who his father was." Jed handed the baby back, fingers lingering just a moment too long. Name him Henry, after his pa. Clara smiled softly. Henry it is. She mounted her horse, settling the baby securely against her chest. The sun was just cresting the horizon, throwing long gold light across the wet prairie. The world felt new, washed clean after the storm. Thank you, Clara said quietly. Jed tipped his hat. Just do right by him. She rode off slow, the baby swaddled tight, the tattered army jacket still wrapped around him. Jed stood there until they were no more than a speck on the horizon, then turned back toward the cabin that suddenly felt emptier than it had in years. Life returned to its quiet rhythm. Jed fixed fences, rode the line, tended cattle. But some nights, he'd catch himself glancing at the basket by his bed, now empty. Months passed. The prairie turned green, then gold, then brown again. And then, one autumn morning, a rider came up the trail. A woman in a clean riding skirt, hair neatly braided, leading a sturdy bay horse beside her. In the saddle in front of her sat a boy, now older, laughing at the sway of the horse. Jed stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Clara waved. Thought we'd stop by. Henry wanted to meet the man who saved him. The boy looked at Jed with wide, curious eyes, the same eyes Jed had seen in the dark that first night. Jed crouched slightly, rough hands resting on his knees. You got big on me? He said softly, and for the first time in years, his voice cracked. The boy grinned shyly, clutching the edge of Clara's skirt. As the sun dipped low over the prairie, Jed found himself smiling. A small, quiet thing that felt as rare as rain in August. He had no family left, no one waiting for him at the end of the day. But knowing Henry Rowland would grow up safe, loved, and knowing his father's name, that was enough. The wind carried across the open land, rustling the dry grass, and for once, Jed didn't feel quite so alone. When Clara and Henry rode away that evening, Jed stood by the fence until the last light faded. The baby he'd once found crying in the night was no longer just a chance meeting on the prairie. He was proof that, in a world as hard as this one, a single act of kindness could change everything. And as Jed turned back toward his quiet cabin, he carried that thought like a weight, and like a gift, that would stay with him for the rest of his days.